So moving on to the next thinking type, we have orthogonal thinking. And orthogonal thinking has one communication type, and that's shared communication. And if you remember in the Standard Behavioral Index, shared communication deals with a relationship between people. There's one person who considers something and kind of conveys that information, and the second person tries to fill in the gaps based on that information that they provide. And that's normally happening between two parties. That's the aversive party, who's the one that's providing the information, and then we have the subversive party, who's filling in the gaps within their own set of characteristics. So with horizontal thinking, the problem is in the individual characteristic. The problem happens when each one of those characteristics either isn't resolved or you kind of fail to achieve that level of activation. In orthogonal thinking, it's a little bit different, and the thing that becomes abnormal is the relationship between the aversive and subversive party. And the general term for the entire problem with orthogonal thinking is something called shared identity disorder. So both of these are related to shared identity disorder. And that dynamic can go wrong on either side of things. And you can think of them based on what happens when that relationship is facilitated. So there's aversive identity disorder, and the term that standard theory uses to address that is something called forced identity disorder. So in an aversive sense, the thing that's going on in a standard way is that a person is considering some social thing, and that's referred to as a social identity. They're bringing that about and communicating something about it. So that's referred to as normally their social identity, and that's denoted by a 9 characteristic. And normally you're going to add that to whatever the result of the subversive party's kind of relational interpretation is. But in forced identity disorder, the thing that's going to happen is that the aversive party is going to use whatever they want here. They can make something up, they can lie about it, they can tell them the wrong thing, but they're doing so in order to have the subversive party match whatever the aversive party wants them to believe. So they're forcing an identity onto the subversive party by withholding information, by giving them false information, by lying to them. They're doing something that's going to prevent them from taking a pure and true consideration about the information, a non-biased kind of approach to that. So that's sort of what forced identity disorder is. And when that happens, you may not have a 9 characteristic here. You may have 10 or 11 or 8 or 6 or 1. But whatever the true characteristic happens to be is being presented as though it's a 9 characteristic. So that becomes a problem later on when the subversive party tries to make sense of that, and all of a sudden there's other things involved, or there's something that they weren't told, or there's some mismatch between what the reality is and what the aversive party provided for them. So because the aversive party is trying to force what their beliefs are onto the subversive party, they're trying to influence what they're dealing with, that's referred to as forced identity disorder. And another term you can use is false identity disorder, but essentially referred to as just forced identity disorder. So that's essentially what can happen on the aversive side of things. You just kind of lie or mislead or withhold information to the other party. So on the other hand, the relationship can go wrong with the subversive party, and that leads to something called subversive identity disorder. And if you think of the dynamic that's happening here, the aversive party is providing some information, whether it be true or not, and the subversive party is waiting. They're using that relationship to determine their own individual understanding of something. And what happens in subversive identity disorder is that the subversive party will not act alone. They will not get into their silent communication. They will not get into self-communication. they will not decide without having an example of the aversive party there. They won't be able to make their own decisions. They won't be able to come to their own conclusions. And without having somebody to give them that example, they just kind of dissociate. They kind of just void themselves out. It becomes very difficult for them to handle whatever it is they're doing on an individual level. And that happens when you put the relationship as a priority over yourself. That's essentially what's going on with subversive identity disorder. That relationship becomes way more important than whatever your self-interaction is. It becomes way more important than whatever your intimate identity is. So whenever you put that relationship as top priority, it makes it very difficult to function and to make your own decisions without that. And those are essentially the two sides that you end up with, either someone providing false or wrong information from the aversive side, or the subversive side not really being able to function without the input of somebody else. And anytime that happens, you're going to end up with an abnormal amount of information. So, even if you normally would have 9 plus 7, whatever that would normally be, 16, if you actually try to remove something from that, there's a chance that it ends up being unresolved. If you do a normal decomposition from here, you're supposed to have a social interaction, but for whatever reason, the subversive party does not consider this as a social interaction. They're considering this as something like their silent identity, or they're considering something like this as their intimate identity. But for whatever reason, the influence of this characteristic does not match with whatever the subversive party is going through. And for that reason, you have to work the other way around. If you can recognize that they're going through something with their, they're trying to apply this information to something about their self-interaction. So let's say the aversive party said that if you only sleep 30 minutes a night, you'll have 10 times more energy than if you were to sleep 8 hours. So for whatever reason, they try to only sleep 30 minutes a night, and now all of a sudden they're tired all day. But they believe whatever the aversive party said. So now these things don't match. So now if you just subtract what was supposed to be the Stein characteristic, you get 7 again. But they're trying to do something about how much they're sleeping, which is a self-interaction problem. So there's some disparity in the information that's happening. There's some mismatch that's there. And that's kind of how you can define the shared identity disorder. And that's sort of the result of having a forced identity put on you. And it's also a result of not being able to make decisions on your own. So that's essentially the consequence of what shared identity disorder leads to. And those are the two primary types, is the forced identity disorder and the subversive identity disorder. So if you think about the horizontal thinking type, everything is based on the individual characteristics. But when you think of the orthogonal thinking type, it's based on the relationship and how the priority is placed. And the result of that will also affect horizontal thinking, but the primary dynamic in orthogonal thinking is going to be the relationship between the two parties. And that's essentially the abnormal dynamic of shared communication. So far in the R scale and the non-standard index, we've gone through the horizontal thinking type, we've gone through the orthogonal thinking type, now we can get to the absolute thinking type. So in horizontal thinking, the primary focus of the abnormal thing was going to be the individual characteristics. In orthogonal thinking, the primary problem is essentially the relationship between people. In absolute thinking, the primary problem is the grouping and sorting of the ideas. And one thing that can happen is that you add additional ideas when you don't need them, and the other thing that happens is that you ignore ideas when you shouldn't. So mostly what's happening is some issue in the way that you group and sort the ideas. And at each stage you end up with a different problem. So we'll start with the characteristics that are part of absolute communication. So the first was the 25th. And the abnormal aspect of the 25th characteristic is the same as the normal aspect, and that's essentially just three-party shared intimacy. And that's the same problem as the normal version. You just realize that there are too many things to consider, and you have to try to resolve that, but there are too many things to try to solve at once. So that is the same as what's in the normal index. It's the same problem. It's just that you can think of it as a normal or abnormal sense. In a normal sense, you would realize that, okay, there's something to solve. In an abnormal sense, you would try to make a connection between those when there's not really any indication as to why you do them. And very often you can get information confused, you can take the wrong side, you can interpret what's going on in an alternate way. But the issue in an abnormal sense is that you're trying to make a connection instead of realizing that you have to do something else. So that's sort of the same. It's just kind of whether you're doing it one way or the other. And from there we have the 27th characteristic. And in the standard sense, the 27th characteristic is the supersocial identity. So there are a couple things that can happen, and one of them is called personification. And if you think about the supersocial identity, the only reason that you need to deal with that is because there are too many identities being compared at once. It's kind of the same aspect of three-party shared intimacy, but you realize that those identities are there. So in personification, the thing that puts you into that mode is considering that many identities. So one thing that can happen is that there's an identity that doesn't need to be sorted out, and that's called personification. And that's where you just associate some external thing to something that's otherwise very easily communicated. So it's kind of easy to think about personification if you think of like an animal or something, and you say, you know, that guy reminds me of some kind of animal. He's some kind of tiger or lion or something like that. You could just say that guy's, you know, courageous or vicious or brave or whatever, but instead you bring in an additional kind of comparison just for effect. And that's essentially what personification is about, because if you sort everything back down, you're basically left with the same as you would without that additional identity. So it's adding an unnecessary identity for some purpose. You could do it to mislead people, you can do it for dramatic effect, but otherwise it's just an additional identity that's otherwise unneeded. And that's kind of the entire idea of personification. But along with that, there's the idea of depersonification. And depersonification is related to adding an additional identity, but in a derogatory kind of way. It's kind of like forcing someone to realize, hey, something's going wrong, here's what would make it worse. Or hey, something's bad, here's something that's bad on top of that. So depersonification is sort of used to make fun of people. It's used to try to sort of allude to a problem. And it's just kind of a suggestive kind of thing that is like, hey, things are bad, they could be even worse. So those are kind of the primary aspects of dealing with this, is the number of identities that you're trying to consider, and then whether or not those identities are actually necessary. And in both cases, they're probably not necessary. And the only difference is that one is done for sort of to add something to the situation and sort of, you know, compare an additional thing. And the other one is done in kind of a detractive kind of way, saying, you know, things are bad, and then this will make it worse. So those are kind of what happens at the 27th characteristic during supersocial identity, is that you kind of mismatch or mix and match the number of identities or the actual identities that you're comparing. So to move on from there, there's also 54th characteristic. And the standard version of that is the supersocial interaction. And there are a couple different things that can go wrong there. And the first one is something called the conditional relationship. So if you think about the whole process of taking these ideas and then grouping them together and then considering which ones are more similar and which ones are less similar, a conditional relationship is going to put a stress or strain on one of those identities. And you can kind of think of it as a prejudice, you can kind of think of it as a predisposition, but for whatever reason, you have some kind of deep-seated interpretation of that identity. So maybe you have some problem with people wearing the color yellow, and you see someone wearing a yellow t-shirt, and for whatever reason, you don't like that person's wearing a yellow t-shirt. So you don't know anything else about them. You don't know, if they need to tell you something. You don't know if they're going to talk to you at all. But you see they're wearing a yellow t-shirt, and all of a sudden you make a kind of judgment based on that. But you can also think of that in a much more extreme sense, in things like racism and prejudice and so forth. But before you get to the point where you actually have to consider those ideas, you've already kind of grouped them together and decided what the outcome of them are without actually comparing them or without actually going through the experience of considering that information. You kind of just solve that problem from a distance rather than actually organically working through it. Because otherwise you would have no consequence. There would be no consequence to somebody wearing a yellow shirt. You may not even notice it, but because of that condition that you've placed on that person or on the color yellow or that t-shirt or whatever, all of a sudden you have a preemptive sorting of whatever that problem may happen to be. And that's sort of what a conditional relationship is. You can kind of think of like favoritism in that kind of sense. It's just a otherwise unexplained weight to the way that you try to sort those problems out. And it doesn't have to be a bad thing. You could be overly affectionate to animals because you used to own a certain pet. And for whatever reason, every type of that animal that you see, they're just your favorite kind of thing ever. But in reality, that animal may bite you or may cause some problem to you or whatever. But before that happens, you think that they're the best thing ever. So it doesn't necessarily always have to be a negative thing. It doesn't always have to be a positive thing. But there's just some additional consideration that changes the way that you sort or solve the relationship between those different identities. So the other thing that can happen, which is truly a negative version of something, is called a disinterest. And a disinterest is a little bit difficult to explain exactly what's going on, but essentially you are associating an incomplete cycle of communication with a person or an identity that you haven't ever been around or haven't interacted with, and it's almost always negative. It's always a terrible thing. As soon as you see that thing, immediately you're put off by it. You're disgusted by it. You don't have any reason or rhyme to it. You haven't actually interacted with that thing or with that person, but as soon as you see them, you're just completely put off. And you may not have any interaction with them, you may not communicate with them, you may not even come near them, but as soon as you see them, you're immediately forced to apply a kind of negative connotation to that. And that's more of the harmful kind of version of a supersocial relationship. It doesn't matter who the person is, it doesn't matter what they've done, it's just as soon as you see them, it's immediately a no-go. And that's kind of the negative version of a conditional relationship, but it's always negative. There's not a positive kind of disinterest, even if it's harmful, even if it's something that you've been through. It's always that you refuse to give it another chance. You always refuse to go around it. It's kind of an extreme version of that. So that's the idea of the disinterest. And those are related to how you go about facilitating the interaction between otherwise, comparable identities. And beyond that, there's the process at 117 characteristics. And the process that happens there is gapping. And that just means that you don't have a way to consider these preemptively. If you get to a situation that you're not sure how to handle, and you don't have a way to refer to it, or you don't have a plan of action, you're going to gap. You hit the gap and your brain's going to slow you down. It's going to prevent you from continuing to try to solve all these problems, and it's going to force you out of comparing these levels of information, these kind of groups of information. So it's very tough to deal with. It's just a physical limit. But as soon as you consider this amount of information without a strategy, without a plan, your brain is going to slow you down and sort of force you to stop what you're doing and solve the problem at a different time or in a different way. So these are all going to be related to how you group and sort this information at the different levels. But the other thing that was mentioned in the standard version of this is just putting additional weight on these. So what you could do is just add additional considerations to one of these, and those were sort of things that would add a characteristic without going to the next level, or take away a characteristic without going to the next level. And those were referred to as directives and deferrals. So that would, 2 directives at 27th characteristic would end up being 29 characteristics of communication. Similarly, 54th characteristic with 1 deferral would lead to 53 characteristics of communication, and so on. So the other thing that can happen with the directives and deferrals is that you mix and match them. You kind of just add them willy-nilly. And those are referred to as pseudo-directives and pseudo-deferrals. Let's come to the side here. So yeah, you have a pseudo-directive and a pseudo-deferral. And the pseudo-directive is saying, I really agree with this, but once you're no longer in the supersocial kind of realm, you kind of do something different. That's kind of saying, I'm really interested in keeping the streets clean, and then once you get away from the public spotlight or whatever, you're over in the corner like throwing litter on the ground. So that process of saying that you want to keep the streets clean would be a pseudo-directive in that situation. The pseudo-deferral would be something like saying, I hate to eat meat, and then whenever you go back to your own private life, you have some kind of animal, probably meat, steak or something like that. So when you're in public saying that you hate eating meat, that's kind of deferring, that type of behavior. But whenever you're away from the public spotlight, you kind of do that thing directly. So those are kind of the difference between pseudo-directives and pseudo-deferrals. And they're also used just to kind of get through the situation, just to kind of facilitate whatever the need of that situation is. Even if it's not true, even if you really don't believe in it, you kind of just throw it out there to kind of make it through the friction that you need. But more or less, those are going to describe how people change one way or the other, how they group and sort information in sort of the non-standard way. So standard version of the 25th characteristic is 3-party shared intimacy. The standard version of the 27th characteristic is the supersocial identity. And the standard version of the 54th characteristic is going to be supersocial interaction. The standard version of the 117th characteristic is going to be supersocial orientation. And the non-standard version of 117 is going to be gapping or disorientation. Then the non-standard version of the 54th characteristic is going to be the conditional relationship and the disinterest. Then the non-standard version of the 27th characteristic is going to be personification, which is adding additional identities, and depersonification, which is adding sort of negative connotation to those identities. And then finally, the abnormal version of 3-party shared intimacy is trying to decide or make a decision even when there's too much information going on. And with that, we've gone through the entire R scale. That's all the abnormal version of the R scale. We started with the seeing what happens when we alter the components of impulse, and then we went through the horizontal thinking type, we went through the orthogonal thinking type, and now we've gone through the absolute thinking type. So what we can do next is consider what happens in the abnormal version of the z-scale. So now that we've gone through the z-naught scale in a non-standard way, we've gone through the r-scale in a non-standard way, we can look at the z-scale in a non-standard way, and we'll start with the normal ranges of communication. And the thing to keep in mind is that in the standard sense, those ranges are what's going to happen under normal operation, and they're going to be related to the components of impulse. But it's also important to realize that what happens there is going to rely on what happens in the R scale after it's been compressed and moved over. So because of that, there are a couple of ways to consider how to think of them as an abnormal kind of sense. So there are two main things that we can do, and essentially what we do is reorganize the z-scale. And one way we do that is called the z-range scale. And the other thing that we do is the z-scale with complexities, which we'll just call the z scale. So with the z-range scale, the only thing we're looking for is whether one single idea fits within a normal range. And the way that we can do that is by considering what our problem is and seeing if a person solves that problem within that range. And if they do, then it's fine. But if it goes beyond that range, we realize that we've gone through the metaphysical range, and now they're using impulse to solve the problem. And if they go through the impulsive range, we realize, okay, now they're using impulse to solve the problem. If they go through the compulsive range, we'll say, okay, well, there's a compulsive problem going on there. And then beyond that, they may be going into compulsive impulse. And if we do that, then we just realize, okay, that problem is in the normal range of issues, and we can just kind of determine how difficult it is for them to solve that problem. So that's all we have to really consider. Even if it's abnormal, even if they're struggling with it, even if it's a non-standard process, we can just say, okay, it's basically under control. It's not that bad of a problem. But if they're trying to solve that problem and they struggle with it and they get into impulsive communication, we realize, okay, that's out of the normal range. That's beyond the limit. So now there's some factor of impulse that's preventing that problem from resolving itself. Same with compulsive communication, same with compulsive impulse. So that's a very general way to do things. It's very easy to do that. And that's really all we're looking for, is how difficult is it for this person to solve this problem. And if it's continuously into the compulsive impulsive range, then we know that there's some other problem happening there. There's something that's not being resolved, and there's something that needs work. Similarly with the other ranges. But that's all we're looking for, is how much it requires to solve a single problem. So if they're continuously solving a problem through the metaphysical range, no problem. But if that problem is going from metaphysical into impulse, and then they kind of just ignore it, no big deal. But if they go from metaphysical to impulse, and they continuously try it, and they go to compulsive communication, they continuously try, and whatever, that's going to cause some distress. That's too much being taxed. That's too much effort being put forth to resolve something that's otherwise fairly simple to solve. So in the Z-range scale, the only thing we're looking for is how far are they taking it before it resolves itself. And that's how you can tell how bad a person's problem is. That's one way to do it. The other thing we have is the Z-scale with complexity, or just the ZC scale. And this one is a little more detailed. So if you go back to the original Z-scale, if you think about the standard version, every one of these, I'm going to just kind of show it on this side, kind of in between here. Every one of these is dependent on the components of impulse. So you have an impulse, you have a subtraction, and you have a compression. And what you can do with the Z scale with complexities, or the ZC scale, is just determine which one of these they display. So, for example, in the Z range scale, they may they may solve their problem in the metaphysical range. And if you remember the normal range of metaphysical communication, it's -180 to -185. So that means we have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 different aspects of impulse that we can use to solve that problem, okay? So let's say this person doesn't solve that problem at that point. Now we see an impulse, they have to use two additional kind of factors to try to make sense of what's going on. So now what we can do is try to determine what exactly is going on in terms of the amount of information. So it's just a little more specific way to think of this. So we have from negative 180, 181, 182, 183, 184, 185, 186. So now we have 6 instances of impulse. So that's something we can tell for sure. We have 6 times where they've tried to apply meaning. The same way that you can observe the components of impulse, you can try to determine how many different facets that idea has that they're trying to solve. So now you have 7 different instances of impulse. So to really deal with the Z-cell complexities, we have to think about all the different components of impulse. We have to think about all the subtractions that are missing. We have to think about how much information that would be. And then we have to think about all of the compressions that are missing. Why each one of these things have not been compressed yet. And what we can assume is that at the very end, we have an actual compression. We actually have that problem solved. The issue is what all this other disparity is. So I'll go ahead and demonstrate that. With impulse, we have 7 of them. With subtraction, we have 7 of them, let's say. And with compressions, we only have 1. There's only the final one that was compressed. So we have 1 of those. So if we look at standard units, we have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 cycles of communication. So we should be able to multiply 7 times 1.5. So if we multiply 7 times 1.5, we should get 10.5. So after we do everything and add everything up together in our individual units, we should get a net amount of units of 10.5. So if we bring that over here, we have 7 times 1/2, that equals 3.5. We have 1.5 times 7, that equals 10.5. And then right here we have 1, which equals 0.5. And remember that our compression is the opposite of our impulse. So if we add all this stuff together, this gives us 14 minus 0.5, so we have 13.5. So there's something wrong. Where the person who's going through all this went through 7 cycles of communication, we should have 10.5 units. Now we have 13.5 units. So there's some dysresolution in whatever that person's going through. And that's how we can sort of quantify how bad that problem is. And there are a couple other things we can do to figure out what's exactly going on there. So if we take the difference between those two, so 10.5 minus 13.5 minus 10.5, we end up with just 3. And what we're thinking of is this is the number of units that we have. So if one subtraction is 1.5 units, one characteristic is going to be 3 units. We can try to figure out why a person is going through all this. We think about which characteristic that would be. We get one characteristic of communication. We think of the first characteristic. We can observe and see if that makes sense or not. But that's essentially the disparity between what this person is going through and the amount of information they displayed. And it's a little bit more difficult to apply that in real life, but that's the general idea, is that you can just follow each individual component of impulse and figure out what the disparity between what should be displayed is and what's actually being shown. And the fact that it's out of range also lets you know that there's some level that is pushing it out of range. So that seems to be the complement to whatever that person's going through. That's kind of the idea behind the way that the Z scale with complexity should be used. It's just a way to follow each individual unit, but that's assuming that you can actually observe all of this. It's assuming you have a way to document it and all that stuff. But the much easier way to do it is just use a Z range scale and just to look at how far they get into their communication. But if you need something more specific, you use a Z scale with complexities. There are some other studies that standard theory sort of bleeds out into, kind of extends to some more advanced versions of it. And once you get into those, it's where the Z scale with complexities becomes way more useful. But that's if you really want to try to quantize what's going on with the person. That's if you really want to look into making mathematical models with this. And it's also extremely important in determining the severity of diseases and that kind of thing. But that's essentially how you look at the normal range of the Z scale, either through the range or through adding up all the individual units and trying to keep track of that, and defining the disparity between what should normally happen in that number of cycles versus what you've observed. And that should tell you a little bit about the reason that these haven't been compressed, or the reason that the subtraction is missing, or the reason that there's a lack of impulse or too much impulse. But that's essentially how we look at abnormal processes on the scale of post-intelligence. So on the Z scale, besides the normal range of post-intelligence, there's also rolling communication. And rolling communication is already sort of in between normal and abnormal. So the thing that you can address abnormally is sort of what the person's sort of end game with that is. And in rolling communication, there are essentially just two things to consider. And that is essentially based on which pseudo-additive impulse they use to communicate. So in normal rolling communication, you have pseudo-additive impulse, but the end game of those is going to be one of two things. So in rolling communication, you can end up with a positive kind of outcome, where you can think of a high energy kind of outcome, and that outcome is referred to as an initiative. And the initiative is essentially serving the purpose of communicating that thing later. It's that person trying to give you as much information as possible, so that when the time comes, you have some awareness of it, and you can say this. The person can say, "This is what I was talking about," and that's sort of the initiative. And it's a means to facilitate communication later on, when you're not necessarily stuck in limbo between intelligence and post-intelligence and so on. It's their way of trying to get you involved and get you aware of what's going on in order to communicate that thing a little bit later. So that's kind of the hallmark of an initiative, is that you're trying to tell them all these different things so that you're aware of what's going to happen later on if everything goes the way that they plan. So that's referred to as an initiative. And the second thing that can happen, which is sort of the negative version of that, is something called the derogative. And a derogative is where you share these pseudo-additive impulses, but you do it to sort of make things impossible. You say, it's not possible, it's never going to happen, even if you try, you're going to fail, that kind of thing. So you're communicating all these things, but when the time comes, the person realizes, okay, that's not going to happen. They realize, oh, it's not possible. They're kind of on a letdown, as it were. So when it comes to the purpose of putting all of these things together, the end game is going to be one of these two things. You're trying to do it so people understand what's happening, kind of in a constructive sense, or you do it to try to mislead and confuse people and trick them and say, haha, got you, that kind of thing. That's what a derogative is. So even though rolling communication is already kind of a mismatch kind of thing, there is still a way to think of it abnormally, because if you're not doing it with one of those two intentions, it's just happening. And so that's kind of why you can think of it as a standard kind of thing, is that you're just trying to figure something out. You don't have any purpose behind it. But if you try to make purpose with that, it's kind of abnormal because it's very mismatched and very awkward. But those are the two kind of things that you end up with, is something called an initiative or something called a derogative. And that is essentially the idea of the abnormal version of rolling communication. So with that, we've gone through the Z0 scale, we've gone through the R scale, and we've gone through the Z scale. We kind of wrapped around the complex communication. All of it's abnormal in complex communication, and then there's an abnormal version of complex communication, so we don't really necessarily need to go through that again. It's all pattern recognition at that point because it's beyond what the normal kind of limit is. But there is one more scale to mention, and that's called the dark scale. And the dark scale is a hidden area of the R scale, and it's the scale of true intelligent derangement. So it's the true measure of the abnormal scale of intelligence. So the same way that the Z scale kind of sums up everything in those certain ranges, the dark scale sort of sums up all the abnormal stuff in the intelligent range. So now that we've talked about everything else, we can finally talk about the true scale of intelligent derangement, which is called the dark scale, or the D scale for short. So finally, the dark scale, or the D scale. So the D scale has a specific range to it. That range is from 25 characteristics to 18 characteristics, and it's sort of split in half. There's an impulsive side of the D scale, and then there's a compulsive side of the D scale. So the impulsive side is going to be from 25 to 21, and then the compulsive side is going to be from 21 to 18. And trying to explain this is a little bit difficult. There are several different ways to think about it, but this scale measures the culmination of abnormal amounts of information being combined into characteristics. So if you think of the original dynamic of the scale of intelligence, you have a normal symmetric unit of information, you have another normal symmetric unit of information, you combine them, all of a sudden you have a characteristic, and that is a standard characteristic of communication. So with the D scale, some part of that process is going to be complex. Some part of that process is going to be abnormal. Whether it be one unit is abnormal, whether it be the next unit is abnormal, or whether the connection between them is going to be abnormal. What you're going to deal with is some non-standard amount of connections happening, and that's going to lead to some problem. And each one of these characteristics in this range are going to measure how many abnormal processes there are. So the 25th characteristic is basically going to be no problem. There's just something that's unresolved. That's going to be one complexity. So you get one unknown cycle of communication, and what you try to do is resolve that. And if you resolve that, great. And if you resolve it, you end up with one complexity. And that's all it is, just one unresolved thing. But at the next cycle of communication, you have two unresolved complexities. You don't know what the problem is at that point. You have two complexities, and then 3 and 4 and so on. And that's kind of like the 25th, 24th, 23rd, 22nd, and then if you go beyond that, you end up in compulsive communication. So the way I like to think about this is by explaining what's happening with rotation. So let's say that we have our standard connection here that is defined by the normal standardized explanation of intelligence. And then let's say something goes wrong. We have an abnormal process, and then we have some other weird unknown process. Now we have to try to make a connection between those. If you think about this in terms of how the brain is measuring these processes, when we have the standard version, these have the same amount of information, and if you kind of stack them from heaviest thing to lightest thing, they're going to be right around the same kind of level, and that connection is fairly easy. That's the reason that people are able to make those kinds of meanings. But if that's abnormal, one can be measured kind of really high up on the scale, one can be measured really kind of low down on the scale, or it could be at a weird angle, it can be flipped, it can be turned, but they're not as easily comparable as would the standard version of things. So not only are they kind of oriented weird, there's also the chance that the connection between them is not going to be direct. So in order to make that happen, you have to do a little of finagling. You have to kind of change something, you have to rotate it, and you have to force that connection to happen. So not only would you get some kind of weird shape and weird things being connected, you also may have to take some kind of weird path in order to get those connections to happen. And every time you do that, you can determine how that connection actually comes about in terms of something called a complex rotation. And it's just a kind of a mathematical term that you can use to think about something that exists outside of 3 dimensions. There are more possibilities and more directions of movement going on. And the more you do that, the more you rotate that connection between those things, the more stress you're putting on the brain. You're trying to force that to be true when the brain doesn't have its own real storage of that information. And that's part of defining these as being irregular, being not well compressed, or being some other kind of weird process. So once you do this enough, you define this entire thing by a complex rotation. There's some angle. After you add all this stuff together, there's some angle that describes what's going on here. So when you get to compulsive communication, not only are you starting with that angle, whatever the culmination of all that stuff is, you're also combining it with something else that's irregular. So now you have a weird angle plus 1. And so you have some complex thing plus something else. And every time you do that, you're either going to have a weird angle and a weird angle, or you're going to have your whatever your normal weird angle is plus something else. So now you have a weird angle plus some variable, either another weird angle or plus 2 or what have you. But now, instead of combining something that's standard and something that's regular, you have some strange connection happening, and you're trying to combine those otherwise odd things with that strange connection. So even if it's something completely normal, even if it's something that's otherwise commonplace, if you're doing that based on this weird rotation, this weird connection that you have to resolve some kind of problem or something, you're trying to combine those things in a way that normally wouldn't happen on its own, or you're trying to do some roundabout thing to make it happen. So that sort of separates how you go from impulse to compulse, and that's kind of the best way I can describe it. Every time that you do this, every time that you combine something, you end up with a dark cycle of communication. So the first time you do it is 1 dark cycle of communication, the second time is 2 dark cycles of communication, third dark cycle, fourth dark cycle. And that's all an impulse. And then you have a compulsive dark cycle, the second compulsive dark cycle, all the way through. And after that, you kind of end up at your terminal points. So impulsive communication, its kind of end game is something called exploitation. And that's how it's used in communicating with people. And in exploitation, all you're doing is combining these irregular kind of things, and you're trying to get somebody else. You're saying all this random stuff. You're trying to get somebody else to interpret whatever it is you're saying. And if they try to standardize that, if they try to make a normal meaning out of this otherwise nonsense, that becomes your new interpretation of these kinds of things. So you're using them as an exploit. You're exploiting their interpretation and using whatever they said as your new way to apply meaning to that otherwise weird kind of twisted thing. So if you're being dishonest, or if you're lying to someone, or you're giving false information, or you're trying to stretch the truth, or you're trying to twist something, all those things, all those are being done with your own internalizations. And when you do that in an abnormal sense, there's a pattern that happens, and there's a specific limit to that. And that's what true intelligent derangement is. That's what true intelligent, non-standard communication is about. It's combining incompatible information. It's combining false information. It's making up connections between things that otherwise have no business being connected, and so forth. So the final version of that is called exploitation. Once you get to compulsive communication and you continuously make these additional kind of weird connections with weird shapes and weird angles and anything that's not non-standard, what you end up with is a process called coercion. And at that point, you're dealing with nonsense. The only thing you're trying to do is get somebody to respond, whether they respond through their body language, whether they respond through like startle response, whether they respond through ignoring you, whether they respond by walking away. When you're doing this whole process of lying and being untruthful and doing all these deranged kind of things, when you're doing that just to get a rise out of somebody, you're coercing them into responding. You're kind of forcing their hand. You're making them provide some kind of interpretation that's otherwise involuntary. You know, it's not like saying, oh, ha, that was funny, or oh, ha, whatever. It's literally forcing them to respond to some other nonsense in a way that is otherwise non-voluntary, especially through body language, especially through nonverbal communication and that kind of thing. So those are kind of the extremes that you get in the dark scale, and that's the true scale of derangement. And once again, it's all based on combining some non-standard process, and every time you combine that non-standard process, you get a dark cycle of communication. So impulse, you can do that about 4.5 times, and then compulsive communication, you can do that about 3 times, 3.5 times. And once again, this has some symmetry to the other aspects of the behavioral index. If you think about how many times you can group and sort, this kind of looks like supersocial communication. And then if you look at how many times you can kind of gap out vertically, kind of 1, 2, 3, that's kind of what's going on there. And that's another way that the R scale and the Z scale are kind of congruent to one another, kind of describe the same thing. So that pretty much ends the abnormal or non-standard behavioral index. The only thing to really address from here is memory. And I think in one of the previous videos, the standard version of memory was addressed. And I know for sure that in the book version, the non-standard version of memory is addressed. So what I'll go ahead and do is address the non-standard version of memory, which is cyclic thinking. And we can also run through the entire abnormal behavioral index. And from there, hopefully, we can start to talk about some things that are a little more advanced. But with that, after including cyclic thinking, we have all of our rules in the standard and non-standard version. And from there, we can look into some of the advanced stuff. Okay, so here's the behavioral index. We have the Z0 scale. We have the R scale. We have the Z scale. We have the Z0 scale explaining the components of impulse. We have the R scale with the 3 primary thinking types, the different communication types, and the individual characteristics. We have the gap. We have the Z scale with the ranges of impulse. We have rolling communication, complex communication that leads out to the V scale. And we also have cyclic thinking and the dark scale. So if you remember, the Z0 scale provides us with the components of impulse. That's impulse, subtraction, and compression. That's going to give us 1 unit of communication, or 1 cycle of communication. And once we obtain all the things we need, we can unlock the potential for intelligence. And we can go through the different communication types, and those are organized by thinking types. The first thinking type right here is going to be horizontal thinking, and we're going to have silent, intimate, and social communication. That's going to be first, second, third, fourth, fifth, sixth, ninth, eighth, seventh characteristics. And then our second thinking type is going to be orthogonal thinking, and we have the range from 10 to 17 characteristics, where we share that process of combining ideas through relationships. And then finally we have absolute thinking, which deals with supersocial communication and trying to figure out which ideas to group and sort. And then we have the limit of our gap right here. And then we start at the metaphysical orientation or the turnaround at negative 180. You can move in a more negative direction to go through the ranges of impulse. We can go in a positive direction to go through a rolling communication. And if we get way far beyond that, we get into complex communication in the V scale. And all of that is stored in memory. We have the first level, which is circular thinking, the second level, which is ovular thinking, the third level of elliptical thinking, and then finally incongruent thinking. And we can also go through that in a non-standard way. So if we have some problem with our components, we'll have an abnormal or non-standard unit. Instead of intimacy, we kind of move away from that. Instead of our silent communication, we try to use our behavior, body language to fix that. Instead of social communication, we'll replace what we should normally be communicating with the environment. In orthogonal thinking, we try to force people to think one thing, or we rely on other people to make our decisions, help us make our decisions. So we have some issue with the relationship there. Then in supersocial communication, we try different ways to group and sort information by adding things that are unnecessary, by making things worse than they need to be, by having a predisposition or kind of prejudice towards people, or by considering too much information at once. Then there's gap. And in our impulsive range, we deal with solving our problems in a specific number of attempts. And if we have a problem that's unresolved for longer than that, we end up kind of moving out of that normal range, and we can consider which range we use to deal with those, or we can consider the individual components of impulse that are associated with each resolution. We can also get into rolling communication, where we either are trying to share information later, or trying to mislead or misdirect people. And then finally we can get back into complex communication, where we're just trying to figure out the patterns and hopefully are not being forced into additional stimulation through those complex kind of problems, those adulterants and so forth. And then finally there's the dark scale, and the dark scale is what happens when you try to combine irregular units, and when you try to make meaning out of things that are otherwise not compatible. And all of those things are part of potentially storing them in an abnormal sense. And the levels of cyclic thinking abnormally are going to be the disruption. After that there's derangement, after that there's illness, and then finally disease. And that gives us all the rules we need. I don't really think there's anything else that we have to use besides those rules. And it really depends on how specific you want to get with them. In reality, you need to be able to recognize impulse, intelligence, post-intelligence, and that's usually sufficient to address or solve a problem that we have. But you can get more specific. You can look at the specific thinking type, or you can look at the specific characteristic. And the main thing you have to determine is whether it's standard or non-standard. So it gives us a fairly good chance of determining what a person's going through, and it gives us a really good chance of trying to solve that problem, and it also gives us a really easy way to organize everything.